Welcome to the Up Arrow Podcast with William Harris, featuring top business leaders sharing strategies and resources to get to the next level. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hey everyone, I'm William Harris. I'm the founder and CEO of Element and the host of the Up Arrow Podcast, where I feature the best minds in e-commerce to help you scale from 10 million to 100 million and beyond as you up arrow your business and your personal life. Excited about the guest that I have today, Justin Mayers. Justin is a seasoned entrepreneur. He's the founder of Kettle Fire as well as Truemed. There's a lot that we're going to talk about both on the brand side as well as provider side here. Justin, excited to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
I was trying to think about who introduced us, and I know we talked about this before, and the best that I can remember is that it was perhaps a Slack channel with either Benji Heim, Wilson Hung, or Sujan Patel. I don't know which one of it is, so I'll thank all three of them because I'm sure at some point in time we've crossed paths with all of them.
Yeah. I used to work with Wilson at Kettle Fire, and then I know the other two well.
Yeah. I remember thinking about the first time we actually hung out, though. You came to Minnesota. We were working together, so we were actually helping you run ads in the early days of Kettle Fire. And you came to Minnesota. We went for a walk around Lake Harriet, and I don't know if you remember this, but I think I had just torn my meniscus at that time, and I didn't know it, but I was kind of hobbling around the path as we're walking around the lake.
Yeah, that was my first time in Minnesota. I remember thinking it was like a beautiful place, and I still have not been back actually.
Really? All right, we got to get you back out.
I know, that's a shame.
Yeah. So before we dig into the good stuff here, I do want to announce our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Element. Element is an award-winning advertising agency optimizing e-commerce campaigns around profit. In fact, we've helped 13 of our customers get acquired, with the largest one selling for nearly $800 million and one that IPO'd recently. You can learn more on our website at element.com, which is spelled ELUMYNT.com. That said, on to the good stuff. I want to start off with the background and journey, specifically on Kettle Fire, because I think it leads into Truemed well. The idea here being that you've been there, done it. You've worked on brand side within e-commerce. You actually scaled that, I believe, to over 10 million in the first 2 years. What was it like building an e-commerce brand?
That was my first time doing it, and so it was hard. Not that it's easy now, but it was certainly, I was making a lot of mistakes that you make just in the early days of starting a company. And so, we also were not well funded. We bootstrapped for the first almost 2 years of the company, and then we only raised about $1 million from there. And for at least until like year 3.5 when we raised much more. But yeah, it was hard, man. I mean, I and my brother, my co-founder, we were just figuring out everything for the first time, like how to do marketing, how to do supply chain, how to do growth, how to do everything that goes into building an e-commerce brand, which I had no experience with, and no one on the team had any experience with. So it was a tremendous learning experience.
I don't think I realized that you bootstrapped that.
For the first 18 months, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a very crucial bootstrapping time. How did you go about building a business when you are very much cash locked? What was let's just say those first 18 months, how did you get customers?
Yeah, it's a good question. We did a couple things. At that time, this was late 2015, we launched, and we had we were the first like shelf-stable bone broth product to launch at that time. And so we were fortunate in that we spent a lot of cycles making a product that was good in a category that had very little innovation. And because it was like a new thing, there were all of these influencers, especially in the paleo world, which, I knew and was sort of involved in, that were talking about bone broth, gut health, like the sort of different things that, when they talk about it, people listen and they want to end up buying it. And so because we were literally the first product on the market, we just went out to a bunch of these influencers and said, hey, can we send you a free box? Do you like it? Like if you enjoy the product, then talk about it with your audience. Like you've already made 100 different posts on why bone broth is great, and you're getting paid none of them. And so, work with us and we'll actually make sure that you monetize and get paid for these. And that plus SEO were like our two biggest channels at first. Like we were able to very quickly rank for bone broth recipes, bone broth, X, Y, and Z things. And then had influencers start to talk about Kettle Fire as sort of like the go-to brand in this emerging bone broth space.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I love the influencer stuff, and I want to come back to that one. But the SEO is interesting to me because I don't hear a lot of brands say that SEO is their like go-to-market strategy. It's a tough thing to sometimes get traction with that.
Yes, very
Is it
hard.
something that you already knew there was opportunity there, and so you said like, I mean, like you said, it's bone broth. If the right category, there's just nobody really competing at first for that. Is that kind of what it was?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, our biggest risk from day one was basically that the market was just not going to be there, that it was going to be too small, it wasn't going to be meaningful. And that was like by far the biggest risk that we were taking as when we decided to start the company. It was just that the market never evolves and bone broth never becomes a thing that a lot of people want. And, you know, the downside of that is obviously like you could be running a subscale business for an indefinite period of time.
Sure.
The upside of that is like no one else is competing for the SEO stuff. And so with like 10, you know, links, basically, like a couple promotions and stuff like that, we were able to very, very quickly rank for a bunch of key terms that that then started driving sales like within the first couple months. So that was unique. I mean, it wasn't a lot of sales. We weren't doing like a crazy amount of sales. And then we also like another thing that helped out a lot is very early on, we started working with Thrive Market, which was just launching. And Thrive Market was like, we became basically, they were running at this time a promotion where basically you would get like, if you sign up for a Thrive membership, you'd also get one free product. It was called like gift with purchase. So buy a membership, you get a free product. And our product of, you know, Kettle and Fire bone broth, that gift with purchase was the best promotion that they were running around that. And so they were doing a bunch of education around like, what is bone broth? Why is it good for you? And giving people literally like buying product from us and giving it for free to like hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people that were trying a Thrive membership. And so that also helped just from like a awareness and driving, you know, getting people like getting on the radar of many different customers that wanted to try our product.
Yeah. So that was almost one of your first maybe forays into wholesale, I assume, or at least something a little bit more
First one,
wholesale
yeah.
versus D2C. Is that when you got the itch to do more? Because I know that you eventually got into other channels, into, you know, the actual stores. Did you plan on going from the very beginning saying, hey, we're going to do this D2C, then get into stores? Or was that after that?
No, that was definitely the plan. I mean, if you look at grocery especially, which is, you know, we're obviously a grocery product, you look and like 90% of grocery dollars are still spent within a retail store. And so, yes, there's stuff that you can do on e-commerce. You can certainly grow like a material coffee company. You can grow like meaningful, all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, for almost everyone, you just have to go into retail. And so if you want to get any sort of scale, you know, selling like a relatively cheap grocery item like a bone broth, you know, today, then we were selling like $13 to $14 a box. Today we're about $7 to $8 a box. The only place that you can get that scale is not online. It's just in retail. And so we kind of knew that we had to do that at some point.
Yeah. So what was that transition like? Is that when you decided to take on an investor because you're like, okay, in order for us to buy the amount that we need to do this, or let me say before we go too far, why did you take on an investor? What changed?
Yeah. So the thing that changed is I kind of thought, I felt very strongly going into starting the business that the biggest risk of the business would be that the market doesn't materialize, that like you know, it ends up being a $5 million business or something like that. And having a profitable online $5 million business that you like own 100% of with your brother is like an incredible outcome. The only way in which it's not a great outcome is if you raise like $20 million and everyone's expecting it has to be a $100 million business. And so kind of like, because I had skepticism or wasn't like totally confident that the market would get as big as it has, we were pretty conservative from a fundraising standpoint. And so once we got to a little over 2 million in revenue, I was like, okay, we've gotten to 2 million in revenue. We have one product line. No one knows who we are. We've spent almost zero on paid ads. Like, I'm pretty sure that we can take this to a 10 or 20 million in revenue over the next couple of years. And so we raised a little less than $1 million. We did a lot of that from influencers and who helped like build the category and talk about bone broth and why it's great for you and all these things. And that kind of helped get us to, you know, to 10 million in revenue. And at that point, then I was like, okay, we got to 10 million in revenue. Like, do I think we can get to 50 or so? And I was like, yes, I actually now see a clear path to getting to 50 million. And so we ended up raising, 16 more or 18 more.
Awesome. I don't want to gloss over what you said too, which was that you built the category. And I think that's an interesting thing. A lot of people go into categories where they're going to just capitalize off of what's already there. And so they have to take from somebody else or something along those lines. But if you're building the category, it's essentially limitless. You don't know what your TAM is. And so you're creating it from scratch. I appreciate that. What about getting into wholesale then? So moving into the grocery stores, what was that process like? Like, what was it like to be able to make the first call? You make the first call, like, walk me through this process.
It's really hard. I mean, at the time, Whole Foods was our first retailer. And so they basically reached out. They don't really do this anymore. They're a much larger, like, Amazon owned institution at this point. Sure. But at the time, basically, they saw one of the buyers saw basically that there was an influencer that was talking about Kettle and Fire that was a big fan of it, saying how they liked it. And he saw us, this influencer talking about our product. He reached out and was like, hey, can I bring this into like 50 Whole Foods, 48 Whole Foods in certain regions in the country? And we said yes. We went in. The average price point for a product in our category was around $4.50 in Whole Foods. We went in at a $10 price point just because like our stuff has really it costs a lot to make, frankly. Sure. And, even though we were twice the price, even though we were selling a brand that no one knew, even though there was like one facing and one product on the very top shelf of a Whole Foods, we started to sell in like the top 25% of all products in that category. And
that's awesome.
Seeing that, like our buyer who brought us in basically was like, okay, you all can move. I'm actually seeing like the sales are coming in. So let's like talk about a national rollout. And so after we did about 9 months of selling in 50 Whole Foods, then we got into like a Whole Foods national rollout the following year.
Amazing. So what did you do to become the top seller there? Was there like you doing tastings at places? Did you have some kind of setup or whatever, or was it just because people saw you online and then just started seeing you there? What was that like?
It's a good question. I mean, frankly, I think that I was dumb about it, but I was this was like totally the wrong reasoning. But at the time I was like, I only want to go into retail if the product is going to see decent traction with us doing like online marketing, influencers, and some email stuff. I don't want to get into this whole game that some brands play, which is, paying for samples and doing demos and doing all this stuff that, especially compared to online, like where you can spend money, the ROI on these things is just really, really brutal. And so, it can work, but I think it mostly works because retail brands don't have other like good channels to put money in and to grow sales. And so I basically made the decision. I was like, we're not really going to invest that much in demos and the like. And so we did a pretty heavy push online. We did some like geo-targeted marketing. We emailed influencers. We talked to like small paleo and CrossFit boxes and stuff like that in different regions where Kettle and Fire was carried, and just like made them aware of, through cold email and other social posts, made them aware that KNF was sold in their Whole Foods nearby. But that was about the extent of it, frankly. Like, we are a much better retail marketing team now than we were when we started. And I think that I probably should have taken that much more seriously. And like, we kind of got lucky in a way that the product still sold.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's encouraging though. Like you said, if you have a good product, did you do a lot of product research? Is this something where you were involved early on with, a core group of alpha testers who are telling you if it tastes good or if it's helping or anything like that?
Yeah. We did this with myself, my brother, my co-founder. We were like the taste testers for a lot of this. We also had some friends and people that were involved in the early like taste testing who were at my CrossFit gym. I like gave it to people that, that I worked with in San Francisco. And so there were a lot of people that were trying kind of the early versions of the product. But that was kind of it.
Yeah. The reason why I brought it up is because it's something that I talk about with a lot of people, especially if it's something that is like you need to try it. So if this is like food and beverage, or, I don't know, a candle where you need to smell it, or whatever this might be, but things where there's a heightened use once you actually have it in your hands and you can see it, smell it, feel it, taste it. That can't be overlooked. I've talked to a lot of brands and they almost all started with some kind of like this out of your trunk kind of thing where you're like, I got to get this in the hands of real people and get some feedback.
Yep, totally. Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, I also do think that we had one advantage with starting Kettle Fire, which was like, ultimately, like I was the customer. And so, sure. I do think that if I was to start like a women's
sure.
gut health drink or something like that, like definitely I would want to sample that a lot and do focus groups and like talk to people. At the end of the day, I had no expectations for how big the business would get. And I was kind of building this for me. And so I made again, maybe not the wisest decision, but was just kind of like, if this is something that I'm going to like, if it is sourcing that I think is important, if it's like the ingredients are good and like all of my healthy fanatical friends that I knew at that time in San Francisco that I was friends with also are like, this product is good and it fits my nutrient sourcing profile. I was like, I'm pretty sure other people will buy this, and that that turned out to be correct.
Yeah, you said you didn't go to this with the biggest expectations because you didn't know what to expect. Why did you start it in the first place? What was the epiphany moment where you were like, hey, this is the thing that I want to do?
Yeah, I think it was an emerging thing, if I'm being totally honest. Like, I think sometimes entrepreneurs, they tell a story of, I like, and this is true of some entrepreneurs too. There's like, this thing has to exist in the world so badly. Keith Boy and a bunch of others talk about like building a startup is like filming a movie. You like know what you want to build, you like hire the people to build it, you cast it, and it's like, this is the vision and this is what we're building. Sure. For me, I felt much more like I wanted to start a company. I knew I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. But I wasn't sure that it was something in consumer. I wasn't sure that it would be even something in health. Like I was basically looking at 3 different ideas that I was testing and thinking about. And the one that tested the best ended up being Kettle Fire. And so when I tested it, I was like, oh, this is a really interesting idea. In retrospect, I think that the reason it tested the best was like, I was the most interested in health and wellness at that time. Like it was taking up all of my spare cycles. It was like my passion. I was reading about it. I was talking to people about it. I was learning about it on my own. And I think because of that, it was the space that I had the best ideas in, was because I had gone the furthest to the edges of health and wellness. And I hadn't in like real estate, and I hadn't in software, which were other 2 spaces that I was looking at or thinking about having ideas in. And so those were kind of those were like really that was my approach. Is I wouldn't say that I lucked into it, but I think I had an idea in a space that ended up working, partially because I was already living on the edge of that space and like had friends that were very into health, and I was very into it myself. And I knew I wanted to start a business, and that was kind of good enough for me. And so when my brother was like, yeah, I'll work with you and I'll skip college to start this company together, he and I kind of like worked and got it off the ground, and just as soon as it started working, it became very obvious that this is what I should be spending all of my time on, not just like some part-time thing.
Yeah. Everybody runs into obstacles as they're building something like this, especially when it's fast paced. Is there any obstacle that stands out that you can remember thinking, this sucks, I don't know if we're going to survive this as a business?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we had a lot of things like this.
Sure.
I would say that one of the biggest was we had a period where we were building and making some investments in supply chain. And we had raised money to do this. We had hired someone that had like a background in working with scaling CPG brands and doing supply chain and operations and stuff. And we had a plant basically, or not a plant, just like a manufacturing line that was 7 months behind schedule. And it was like costing us that, it being behind schedule, you know, we had raised $8 million into the business at that time. And it was basically costing us like $3 to $4 million to be that behind on schedule. And we like didn't have any guarantee of when the thing would actually be back up. And so there was definitely a time where I was pretty nervous that we were going to go out of business, you know, and just be like totally unable to get the plant up and running.
Sure.
I was worried that we would have to go raise a like crazy dilutive funding round or something like that to try and keep things alive. And I ended up parting ways, you know, me running my first company with no experience in consumer, ended up firing our COO that was much more pedigreed. And like, he was a big reason that, you know, that our investors, I think, believed in us when it came time to the funding round. And so it's one of those things that looks okay in retrospect, because we obviously got through it, but there was definitely a period of time where I was like, I don't know what I'm doing in this business, and this guy seems to, and you know, yet the results are not there, and I'm kind of betting on my own decision making and my own intuition that this guy is not the right fit for the job that needs to be done, and I'm going to make a move even though it goes against you know, what I think my investors and what other outsiders might perceive is the right thing for the business. So that was really hard.
That is hard, but good for you for doing that. I think that is something that we don't talk about enough as founders. Is there's an amount of intuition that founders can have that can't necessarily be easily quantified in a rubric, but is just there, especially if you've already found that early success, to say, I can't quantify why this is the right decision, but I feel it's the right decision and I need to act on it. And I think that's something that sometimes we get so data focused, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'd say we need to be data focused, but there are some times where you need to say, I don't necessarily understand why, but I feel like this is the right decision and I need to do it.
Yeah, it is really hard though, because especially me, I felt like my first company, you know, Kettle Fire was like I was a learning machine, and the stance of, I don't really know how to grow a business, I don't know anything about CPG, I don't know anything about any of the stuff that I'm doing, was broadly a very useful place to come from, because it was so true. And so when it came to making many decisions about, should we accept Whole Foods, like what's our pricing strategy, what's our margin, what's our like sourcing, on all these things, I had no intuition around what we should do. And I was just relying on smarter people than me with more experience telling me like what they thought. And it was very challenging for me to operate both from the standpoint of like, I'm going to trust my intuition, but only in this one area, and in every other area, I'm going to also listen to people that have been there and done that before.
Yeah. This is not your only company though. Now you are a serial entrepreneur. You've got Truemed, and so your intuition led you into starting another company. For those who aren't familiar with it, give me a quick synopsis of what Truemed is.
Yeah, great question. So basically what it is there, and this is a problem that I came across with Kettle Fire, is there are $150 billion in these tax-free accounts called health savings accounts and flexible spending accounts. All of these funds today basically go towards, you know, treating people once they are already sick. So they go things like pills, prescriptions, other random procedures, surgeries, stuff like that. What we found is that we found kind of two things. One, health and wellness brands like Kettle Fire want to grow and they want to reach new customers. And at the same time, you have this whole class of customers. Unfortunately, like almost 90% of the US is at risk of one or more chronic diseases. And, you know, they're like, the obesity rate in the US is almost 80%, 93% of Americans have at least one metabolic marker of dysfunction. Like, we're in the midst of a literal chronic disease crisis. And it's in that backdrop where the IRS has said very explicitly that if you are working to address or prevent obesity, if you're looking to like treat, prevent, cure, or alleviate a certain disease condition, a chronic disease, you can use tax advantage dollars in HSA and FSA accounts to pay for things that help treat or fight chronic disease. And so what we realized is that there was a really big opportunity to start a company that handled a lot of the compliance and other infrastructure and made it so that an individual could spend these tax-free dollars, which effectively saves you, 30 to 40% on items and interventions, think like, a Peloton, an Eat Sleep, like class of supplements that studies show are actually effective at treating or preventing chronic disease. Like one of the things that I think is so crazy is, and a recent study came out where it looked at treatment-resistant depression. It was a meta-analysis of about 140,000 people, looked at treatment-resistant depression and like what works to treat very serious depression. And can you guess what like the top results were? They looked at everything.
Well, okay. I mean, we're talking outside of traditional medicine?
No, including pharmaceuticals and SSRIs.
Well, I assume people are probably going to go towards like medication, but outside of that, I'm leaning towards cold plunges.
Include medication.
Well, medication I would say is at the height. Let's say like some type of cognitive therapy would be in there. Going to see a psychologist or something like that. And then the new one that's at least emerging, and I don't know if it was at the time, I feel like cold plunge is being talked about a lot in that.
Yeah, for sure. So the actual ranking after this analysis that looked at treatment-resistant depression is they found that there were a host of interventions, basically. Let me see if I can find it quickly. But effectively, they found that things that worked better than SSRIs for treatment-resistant depression, better than drugs, were dancing, cardio, yoga, meditation, cognitive behavioral therapy, running, lift training, aerobic, anaerobic. It was like every lifestyle intervention basically outperformed SSRIs when it came to treating depression. And yet, if you talk to a doctor, or if you look at how much is the US spending on depression a year, almost every dollar that goes towards treating depression in the country today goes towards an SSRI or pharmaceutical approach, which like effectively does not work better than many of the lifestyle interventions that people could be using instead. And so like what we decided and realized, and what I very strongly believe, is just that there's a whole host of these lifestyle interventions that work effectively and work better than our current sort of stance of pills and procedures that are prescribed to you by a doctor.
Yeah, I love that. I want to call out too, because I agree with that. But meta-analysis, there are some pitfalls to some of those things too, right? It shows correlation, not necessarily always causation, and so making sure that people are aware of that. Being careful with some of these things. There could be a correlation with some random things that may not necessarily always be good, but I love lifestyle stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, a meta-analysis is like sort of the highest standard that we have. I mean, they're analyzing a bunch of RCTs.
Okay. So analyzing the RCTs then too, not just
it's a meta-analysis. So this is not a correlational or observational study. It's a meta-analysis of a bunch of RCTs that included 140,000 people.
That's awesome. That's really good then. You've unlocked the ability for people to be able to use these funds, their HSAs, their FSAs, for buying some other things that are going to improve their health versus just treat symptoms or whatever that might be. What are some examples of companies that are using this effectively in the DTC space right now?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of partners that are using Truemed to drive 10 to 15% of their total revenue. So Eat Sleep is a partner. Higher Dose, which has a suite of red light therapy products, which are incredibly effective, is a partner. The Plunge is another partner. The whole suite of like cold plunge companies. We also work with different supplement brands that across the board. Momentous is one of them. Pendulum is another. And I would say that those are sort of many of the big categories of company that we work with is companies that have products or services that are doing root cause lifestyle interventions. We also work with a whole host of gyms like CrossFit Boxes, 24 Hour Fitness, Crunch, a bunch of these places that help people improve their health. Yeah.
Okay. What about how does this integrate into their website? If somebody was going to use this to turn this on, is this at checkout, or how does somebody best use this?
Yeah, so we're sort of like an Affirm for HSA, FSA, I would say. So we integrate. If you're a Shopify site, it's a one-click checkout or it's a one-click integration, and effectively like after an integration that takes fewer than 20 minutes, your customers can use their HSA or FSA funds, assuming they qualify, to just check out. So they select pay with Truemed at checkout, and they go through that flow.
You said assuming they qualify. Where does that qualification take place? Is that going to be like, why wouldn't they qualify? Is it because the product doesn't qualify, or that person doesn't qualify to be able to use it for those products?
Yeah, so it would be that the individual doesn't qualify. So this is only for qualified individuals that are effectively working to treat, reverse, or prevent chronic disease. And so if you're an individual that is perfectly healthy, has no family history, has no risk factors, anything like that, you are not eligible, according to the IRS, to use your tax advantage money to buy something that treats or prevents a chronic disease, because you don't have one, Sure. And so this is basically only for the class of American that is working to prevent, treat, or like alleviate an existing or potential chronic disease condition. The unfortunate thing for the country is that is a lot of Americans today. It's like almost 90% of Americans.
Yeah. If somebody wasn't qualified, how fast is this turnaround? I just worry about, like, does it ever impact conversion rate? Because it's like, I've got to wait for 5 minutes to find out whether I qualify or not.
Yeah, you can go through it. I mean, it's effectively, it is very similar to a firm. We've done a ton of testing, like on our side with our brand sides and everything, from an A/B testing, conversion, everything standpoint. And it seems to like improve conversion, because you're basically getting a bunch of people in checkout. Like, every merchant knows, I know this from running Kettle and Fire, Perfect Keto, everything like that, that even if someone adds something to the cart, on that checkout, like just before you hit pay, that drop-off rate is anywhere between 30 and 50%. It's crazy. So people are like all the way to the end, and then they're like, they see the price, they think about it, and they're like, I don't know that I can make this purchase. By using tax-free money, these customers are effectively getting a 30 to 40% discount. And brands often are only discounting 30 to 40% once a year on like something like Black Friday. And so, and that's when they see their highest sales numbers ever, right? And so what we're trying to do is give brands a tool to help lower the effective price of their products to the end customer, who is working to fight chronic disease, and many of who might be like more price sensitive. And so we basically see that this is bringing in a new customer and a new sort of customer profile that it doesn't have it does like nothing negative. And we see like many improvements to both like AOV, conversion rate, cart size, things like that.
Yeah. And that makes sense, because you're increasing the amount of people that have the ability to purchase this if they weren't where. So
yeah, I mean, it is very much like a firm. Like, you add a firm to checkout, and your overall conversion rate is not going down, but in fact, you are unlocking a set of consumer that maybe they can't afford a $4,000 Peloton bike or $2,000 Peloton bike to put it on a credit card. But if you stretch those payments over 12 months at an interest-free rate, all of a sudden, like, that becomes affordable to a whole new class of individual. And that's why when a firm went public, Peloton was something like 40 or 50% of their total revenue, because this like easy underwriting thing, what basically made it so that a whole new class of consumers could afford this. Very similar to Truemed, like a firm, someone enters in some information, they get an underwriting and a sense of like, do they qualify or not for a firm within 60 seconds. Truemed, people fill out like a very brief health survey. It takes fewer than like 60 or 90 seconds. And they basically get told at the end of that whether or not they're likely to qualify for receiving a letter of medical necessity. And then for those that qualify, they'll basically get an email within 12 hours that just includes their letter of medical necessity. And they can submit that to their HSA or FSA administrator at some point in the future when or if they're sort of asked for it, or if they have to submit for reimbursement.
It's amazing. I'm trying to think of, just so we're on the same page, I'm trying to think of a reason why somebody shouldn't use it. And you're obviously going to be biased because it makes sense, but I can't think of a good reason. So that's why I'm trying to poke holes in this. What about, man, I'm truly drawing a blank on this. What, is there any reason why this isn't good for somebody? Is there any brand that this isn't good for?
Well, I mean, some brands won't qualify, right? Like if you're selling, some
outside of the brands that don't qualify,
right? Yeah,
like
exactly.
If you qualify, I can't think of a reason why a brand wouldn't want to do this. Is there? Okay, maybe this. If you end up having 15 different things in your checkout, then it's like you need to at least streamline this. Maybe it's not that you wouldn't use this, but you're like, okay, you've got Affirm, you've got PayPal, you've got every other, like there's 15 now different payment buttons. And so that potentially decreases conversion rate. It's not that you shouldn't use this, but that could potentially impact it. I can't think of any good reason, and I'm wondering if you can think of anything.
Yeah, I mean, so we've literally never had a customer like churn, and honestly, we started this company. My partner Callie and I, he kind of came at it with a lot of passion and depth of knowledge about the chronic disease crisis. I came at it from the standpoint of having run merchant and direct consumer brands and built a product that we think works for companies like ours. And, I wanted to build a product that a brand like Kettle Fire could use and would use excitedly at some point. And so we're very focused on making sure that it doesn't impact conversion. It's like a huge win. And so far we've been able to architect a value prop and build a product that we just haven't had, I think almost any customers end up leaving, because I do think that the value prop, once a company gets it, it's just free, it's like free access to a new type of customer for them.
Yeah. And I think that's completely fair. What's your growth journey looked like for Truemed so far? You got this up and running. You've grown this. You've got some killer customers. I think I saw AG1 on there as well. Yeah. You talked about 8 Sleep, some like really fun brands that everybody knows. What has been the thing that has helped you grow this the best? How are you getting the word out?
We have not spent any money on advertising yet. And so, what we are doing from a growth standpoint is, I'd say we have a couple advantages. Like a lot of people from my and Callie's network, we have pretty strong relationships in the health and wellness world. Me from doing Kettle Fire, Callie, he and his sister Casey Means, they wrote what is actually currently the #1 book in the country called Good Energy, on like the chronic disease crisis. His sister co-founded Levels Health, and Callie has just been kind of an advocate in the space for a while, and so knows a lot of people, influencers, brands, companies in this space. And so between the two of us, we were able to pretty quickly get a bunch of influencers on board and sort of like rallied around the cause. Sure. We also, and then once we got like a beachhead, our first 10, 20 merchants, we basically were able to go from our first 10 or 20 merchants, build case studies around what Truemed was doing for them. What did it do for AOV? What did it do for retention? What did it do for conversion rate? How much revenue were they making from it? And take those case studies and talk to more brands, more companies. The other thing I would say too is that we have a tremendous advantage, which is we're solving like a tier 1 problem for brands, which is their growth. Like, how can I grow more is a key question that every CEO, everyone is asking. And I think that in the very early days, we had a lot of companies that would see Truemed on one of their competitors or on some big brand, and because they're just kind of watching, like, what is 8 Sleep doing from a growth standpoint, and they would end up reaching out to us. That was a big one. That's and I think great. That as a founding team, we had a lot of credibility too, when we could say that this is something that we use and believe in for our own companies. And then Callie also has been doing for the last like year plus. He's sort of been doing like a tour of a bunch of health and wellness podcasts. So he's been on pretty much every health podcast that you can imagine, talking to influencers, doing all these sorts of things, talking about the chronic disease crisis, the metabolic disease crisis, and how Truemed plays a role in that. And I think that all of those things together just sort of add up to this marketing sort of like we've just gotten a lot of attention and interest in what we're doing, basically since we launched the company, that has especially picked up in the last year or so. So
very similar game plan to Kettle Fire. Similarly, was SEO a part of the early growth for this, or not as much? No, we're so bad at SEO. We should really fix that at some point. Yeah, that's fair. It's a different game though now, right? Like even SEO it's changed a lot. What SEO means now oftentimes means SEO on TikTok or SEO on Reddit and SEO in a lot of other places. So yeah, and also like I think that Kettle Fire, there was some small number of people that were Googling around for like, how do I make bone broth? What do I do with bone broth? All these things. For Truemed, it's much less clear. Like our target customer is running, growth at a brand, or, the CEO of like a health and wellness company. It's much less clear what they're Googling around for. And they're probably not searching for like
can I accept HSA, FSA via a payment gateway for, like it's just like a sort of a harder thing to rank for as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's completely fair. When you think about growth now, you've successfully grown 2 businesses very well. Outside of the tactical things we talked about from influencer and stuff like that, what are the other things that you think are important for a business to understand or get right to be able to grow?
I think that I think it's so often people think of like marketing channels and getting good at marketing channels. Or maybe I'll rewind. I'll say I think about marketing channels from like a conversion rate standpoint. And if you are selling a commodity product, like, the world's next normal protein bar that is like not special on any dimension,
Sure.
It is really hard to make a marketing channel work that like breaks out and drives a ton of growth just because like you're selling something that's not differentiated. The conversion rate on whatever marketing efforts you do are just not going to be that high. If you're doing something differentiated, then I think that it makes converting and growing through various channels, it vastly increases your odds of success. Now, that's not to say that like things can't work. If you have a massive audience or a massive marketing channel and a massive megaphone, you can kind of sell whatever you want, even if it's a commodity. Like Mr. Beast is selling hundreds of millions of dollars of Feastables chocolate. And like, that's not because his chocolate is like way better than the stuff that you can buy at off the shelf today, but he does have one of the biggest microphones in the world. And so when he like puts something in front of his audience, it's going to work, or the odds are much higher. And so I do think that a lot of it starts with product, and depending on the product, that's sort of, I think that so often you just have to like back into, okay, what is the product that I have? What are the conversations I need to have with potential customers? Because all of marketing is just a conversation happening at scale. And then where do I reach these, where do my like potential customers hang out, and where do they get their information from? For us with Kettle and Fire, we were pretty certain that our potential customer was someone that is interested in making bone broth and or making it on their own, but finds it a hassle and doesn't think that like sourcing is good, but is investing in their gut health and in their health generally. In 2015, when we launched, that was mostly of people in like paleo, Whole30, like those sorts of worlds. And so we just went on an all-out blitz to try and meet a bunch of like the influencers and affiliates and like players in these worlds. We did an all-out blitz to try and rank for SEO for people that were looking for bone broth recipes, that were looking for these various things. And like our first retailer was Whole Foods, which is like where that demo primarily shops. With Truemed, it was a very similar thing. It was like, who is our end buyer? It's merchants. How can we get to the first, 50? Well, it turns out network was the answer to that. And then after we had a network of people that that were using Truemed, we built case studies, and then we started like sending them to some people. We started asking for intros. We like asked our investors and the rest of our network for referrals to people that were like building or running brands that were selling these products in our sweet spot, and we just kind of grew from there. And so I so often think that marketing and growth is like very product dependent, but it all feels like hand-to-hand combat, and it's never something that you're like, oh man, we've totally got it nailed. Like Kettle and Fire, I thought we were pretty good at this stuff. And last year we basically had we had a situation where Dana White, the founder of UFC, went on a bone broth fast and like did this viral video where he had 30 million views, and he's like, Kettle and Fire, this is the best stuff. Like he holds it up to the camera. And he's like, everyone should use this for fasting. And like that blew our sales up. And, we're years into getting good at marketing bone broth and selling bone broth. And like that one shout out probably added, I don't know, $20 million in revenue this year, something like that, maybe more, 10 to 20. And that was pretty wild. And so now I'm like, I've been pretty skeptical of influencer marketing for a long time. But I do think that if something hits like that, like, wow, you can really drive a lot of awareness and a lot of growth doing that.
So this reminds me of your book, Traction, which I need to call out because this is, man, you wrote this a long time ago. But when you and I were walking around Lake Harriet here in Minnesota, we talked about this book, and at the time, my business was me and some contractors, and I was working out of like a Starbucks, right? So it's like me on my laptop. But you talked about traction, and one of the things in your book is not that there's necessarily a set time, but maybe it's 5 years. Typically, it seems like there's around like this 5-year mark. It could be earlier for some businesses, but you reach a point where you've now got, like you said, the network. You've got the traction. You've got a lot of things that are in place. And to your point, it's like if Dana White would have said that year one, it wouldn't have added $20 million. It would have added a little bit. You wouldn't have had the inventory to support it. It would have been a botched effort. But because of where you are, because of the reputation that you've created, because of the distribution you already have, now when he says it, it's this significantly different thing. You had traction. And I think that's an important piece.
Completely. Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah. What about, you talked to me before about market penetration versus EBITDA. What do you think about the difference between those in the companies you had? Obviously, you've got one that you scaled up originally, Kettle Fire, you bootstrapped, but where do you see the line between, let's say, longer term wins within business?
Where do I see say that last part again?
So like, let's say like overall, when you're thinking about like the business and building the business, looking at market penetration, a lot of times people are going really hard after that. And we see this in a lot of D2C companies where they're spending, 2x their, first purchase AOV or something like that to acquire a customer, or, they're 1/3 of their LTV, and they're really going after market penetration versus scaling from an EBITDA focus. Is there one that you align yourself more with?
Definitely. I mean, both strategies can work. It depends on what you're aiming for. For me, I tend to be much more on the build and grow a good business, because a good business has a much higher chance of being around the following year,
sure,
or of selling at some point. But this isn't always true. I mean, I think that there are categories, like in 2015, if I started Olipop or Poppy or, a competitor to one of these sort of new pretend healthy soda brands, then probably I would have lost to them, because they're just going to outspend me, build a bigger brand, build more revenue, raise a bunch of money. And I would have a nice good at the time business, but, would have missed out on all of the stuff that comes from scale, and just would have lost to a group that was going to outraise and outscale me. And so I basically think that as a founder, you have to make the decision of how imminent do I think competition is? How big is the prize at the end of the day? And do I think that it's truly a winner take all scenario? And if it's a big prize, you think people are going to compete with you very soon, and it's a winner take all scenario, or there's going to be one or two winners, like this new soda thing, like Olipop and Poppy are probably one of the two winners. I think if you have a situation like that, it makes sense to raise money, or it could make sense to raise money and try and grow extremely, extremely aggressively. If you are not in one of those situations, if you're building a market that's emerging, where you're not sure how big it'll get, or where you want to sell the business at some point, I think it makes sense to be much more conservative and think about okay, I always thought basically that as a company or as a founder, every year that went by, you basically got the ability to plan another 1 to 2 quarters. And so after our first year, I'm basically deciding, is this a real business at all? After the year one, I'm like, okay, great. We have made some progress. We have some revenue. We have some customers. Let's think about areas that we should invest. Let's hire people. Let's think about supply chain. Let's think about new products to launch. After 2 years, you have a few more products, a few more people. You have maybe more cash in the bank. We had raised money at that point. It was great, let's think on a 2 to 3 quarter horizon. What are the bets that we want to make for later this year? Where do we want to go? Do we want to go into retail? Do we want to do all these things? And now, after the company's been around for 8 years, we're actually thinking in terms of 2+ years ahead. Where do we want the company to go? Do we want to have an exit at some point? Do we want to keep running it profitably? Do we want to expand internationally? Just the set of questions kind of changes. And I think that, I often think that your strategy as a founder should, at the end of the day, depend on 2 things. What is the outcome that you want? Do you want to start a $1 billion business and be a guy that goes after that super hard and
sure,
all of the sacrifices and things that entails, but also a lot of the upside? Or do you want to build a different type of business? And then what will the market support? And I think the intersection of those two things sort of dictates how you should be thinking about the type of business you should like build and scale.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I like the way that you called out that the more history you have, the more you can start thinking about longer distances into the future. It's very interesting the way that we even perceive time as human beings is similar to that.
Yeah.
If you're 5 and you ask somebody what they want to do next year, it's like they almost even don't have a concept of what a year is, right?
Yeah.
You can maybe say like, what do you want to do tomorrow?
Yes.
but you know, when you're 15, you have the ability to start planning out maybe 5 years, but you have no clue what you want to be doing when you're 50. Like it's just too far away. You can't even conceptualize what 50 is.
Yeah.
But to a point, thinking about that from a business perspective makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Is there anything else that you can think of that you've run into that you've maybe changed position on, or you've learned as you've grown 2 businesses successfully? You say, hey, I went into it thinking this is what was necessary for growth. I backtrack, I think, realized now this is very important, or it's not necessarily something that you changed, but you've just realized you're like, this is something that I've learned now in growing a couple of businesses that a lot of business owners maybe are getting hung up on. And they need to shift their focus or their attention, or they need to shift the way they're thinking about something in order to unlock that next level of growth, wherever that plateau might be.
Yeah. Yeah. Things I've changed my mind on. That's a good question. I think like there was a time where I was very like in the camp of never raise money. Just don't do it. It's not worth doing. And I've changed my mind on that. I think that I used to have like a just deep-seated aversion to raising money and like losing control.
Sure.
And I think that now I have an appreciation for raising money as just like one of the many variables in the game of like building a company. It can be good, it can be bad. It just really depends how you structure it and who you partner with. And I'm much more open to raising money to like accomplish certain goals now. Truemed, we're now venture backed. You know, Kettle Fire has raised money. Non-alcoholic wine brand I started has raised money, and so really the only brand that I've started that has never raised any money is Perfect Keto on the brand side, and then like a business that I acquired called FOMO that hasn't raised any money. And yeah, so I've become much more flexible in my thinking around capital allocation and like how and when to raise money, and then how to approach it if you decide that funding, raising money is like the right idea for you.
Yeah. And what changed your mind on it aside from doing this? Was it like a mentor that helped you see this? Is there a book that you read that helped you to understand this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely some mentors were helpful here, I would say. I think that a large piece of it was that I just I felt like more businesses and others that were, that were kind of thinking about fundraising. They were thinking about like the opportunity in front of them. And it just became kind of like a little bit obvious to me that if you're like in a race, the company with the most resources can sometimes win. And,
Sure.
At the end of the day, I think that I ran Kettle Fire very bootstrapped early on. And what that meant was that we were resource constrained on everything. Like, and what that really means is that we hired very inexperienced, cheap people that like we hoped were great. Many of them were exceptional. Also, some of them like didn't work super well. It meant that when something went wrong, which things go wrong in business all the time, this is doubly true if you're like starting your first or second company or in a space that you've never operated in before, like I was. When things go wrong, it goes from shoot, that's like we burned more cash than planned, to the business and like all of the equity value, the jobs, the everything is literally at risk of going to zero. That becomes a risk. And then the last thing, which I've started to appreciate now, running Truemed, is just that for many people, many times, like you want to be solving business problems that are hard and challenging, but you want to be solving the right kinds of problems. Like business is all hard. But I think that the type of problem that is not fun to solve is trying to work with someone that like an employee that's way over their skis, who is like just not frankly getting it, maybe not like doesn't have the capacity or talent, or is in the wrong line of work that you hired to like save on some amount of salary. Solving the problem of how to make that person productive is not a fun problem to solve. Solving a problem of like, how do we build a supply chain that has never been built before as we're launching like a regenerative agriculture bone broth? Or how do we build this like fintech business that is also a blend of healthcare that with a bunch of people that are mission aligned is like a fun problem to solve. And I think the reality is that for me, at least, Kettle and Fire got way more fun when we transitioned after we raised money, and we transitioned from pay people as little as we possibly can, but hope that they're like still really good, which again, we have some amazing people from the early days. But when we brought in our first executives that sure were super expensive, like they were making, 2.5 times what the highest paid person at the company was paying them, what we were paying them at the time. But man, was that worth it? And boy, did the business become a lot more fun when we decided that we were going to invest in bringing really, really good talent into the business. And I think that the reality is, if you are in a market that is big, that's growing, where the opportunity set is large, and like if you win, you have an outcome that's going to be massive regardless. I tend to think that raising money so that you can surround yourself with like the best of the best talent wise, it increases your odds of building a very valuable business. And I think that it also tends to be more fun. It's just the downside is that sometimes requires selling part of your company, but
sure. Yeah, but more fun. I totally agree with you. This has been fun. I want to transition into the who is Justin Mayer's portion of this. I want to talk about childhood a little bit. What was it like for you growing up, and how did that impact you being a successful serial entrepreneur?
It's a good question. I think that I like have very tight, loving family. Very fortunate with how I grew up in general. I think that the things that impacted me is I have a relatively big family. And I think that my dad was always a little bit constrained in some ways by, he, I believe, like wanted to be an entrepreneur and made the decision to instead, which I'm very grateful for, to like have a stable line of work and make sure that like we were in a good spot growing up. And so, I think that at the same time, I also had a appreciation for that not necessarily being the lifestyle or the life that I wanted, was one that, where I would have a 9 to 5 and I would kind of like have a commute and I'd have like all of that sort of thing. And so I think that understanding that from my like high school years was a very useful learning and life experience that pushed me towards wanting to be an entrepreneur and being able to like chart my own path a little bit more. I also really hate waking up early. And so, and I did for my entire life. And so I was pretty much very like, anytime I had a job, I was like, the thing I want is I want to like never have to wake up to an alarm when I'm older. And that was my life goal for many years.
That's hilarious. Especially knowing how much you are invested into health. So getting good sleep is good, but there's a lot of research about waking up, let's say earlier than later.
I wake up early now.
I was just going to say, I was like, how early do you wake up now?
Yeah, I'm like 7 to 7:30 now.
Yeah, exactly. And so everything that you didn't want, it's funny how that can change. And
I know.
Like, looking forward to that.
But not to an alarm. I don't wake up to an alarm now.
Oh, nice. Just circadian rhythm kicking in.
Exactly. That's the big thing.
That is the best.
Dude, it's the best. It's a big thing.
What about any books that have helped shape your understanding that you feel like if somebody's trying to start a business, or maybe not, maybe this has nothing to do with business, this could even be personal, but just a book that you think has been very impactful to you as a human being?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that has been useful for me has been I continually think, and I'm surprised by how the degree to which progress on your business is intimately tied to progress, or how like developed you are as an individual. Like I think it's shockingly hard and it's shockingly common to see that many of your failings as a founder get reflected immediately in how a business is run and how the business shows up. Like, I'm a pretty sloppy, non-details oriented person. And in the early days of pretty much any company that I start, that is reflected in the thing. Like my now wife, I met her a couple months before launching Kettle and Fire. And when we were early in dating, she would just like get the marketing emails that we would send out, and she'd just text me them, be like, typo here, copy error here, like this sort of thing. And so, that is just like, I'm do a lot of things. I'm like very fast moving, which can be a strength, but the downside is just sometimes the details suffer. And so as far as books and things, like, I think that so often the areas where I have improved as an operator, founder, and CEO have also been areas that have helped me a lot as a person. And so for me, like, The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer is one. Reading Mastery by Robert Greene was a big one. Developing and rounding out my mental model of ancestral health and like getting an understanding of health and wellness and how that worked from like a ancestral standpoint was really useful. The Rational Optimist was like another book that was very useful for me. So kind of a whole host of things, but I think they tend to be pretty specific to the individual and like the ways in which, at least in my case, I was not showing up or not doing my best.
Oh, that's fair. We all have those areas, right? And I think that there's important to fix the areas that we're not showing up, but also lean into the areas that we are, let's just say, God-given talents that we are exceptional at as well. And it's like leaning into those strengths as well too.
Yep.
What about, is there anything in your office that you find interesting or fun or quirky or worth sharing with people that you're like, oh, people would enjoy seeing that I've got this here with me?
So I have this like CO2 monitor in my office that I have at all times. Reminds me when to open windows.
Really? Because you're talking too much or what? Like,
no, I just think like fresh air is good.
Sure.
I have these like insane blue light blocking glasses that I use at night that are very intense. And then I got this, I don't know if you know Gary Brecka, but So I went on his podcast recently and he was kind enough to gift me an Echo water. Cool. So I've been trying it. And so like hydrogen water, giving it a try. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Cause he talks a lot about what, methylated folate or something like that, right?
Yeah. Methylfolate and stuff like that.
Oh, that's very interesting. That's cool that you got to go on his podcast. I've definitely seen him around a lot. I've watched a lot of his stuff. I like it and enjoy. I've got a really good TikTok feed of just health and wellness that shows up for me. So
yeah, amazing.
Cool. Yeah. Speaking of that, then, clearly, I always like asking what people are up arrowing in their personal life, and you've kind of already hinted at this, but you're working to consciously improve your health. You're using blue light blocking glasses. You've got, some really special water. I mean, there's bone broth. Like, there's all of these things that you're doing to consciously improve your health. What spurred this incredible desire to biohack?
Yeah. So I don't think it's like, some people are, I would say, biohacky types. I don't think that I'm necessarily interested in it from I don't know. I just don't get into like the biohacking stuff as much.
Sure.
I just tend to think, and I really strongly believe that the biggest issue in the US is the chronic disease crisis, like bar none. And I think that we have such limited understanding of why America and why Americans are like sick at record levels, like what's going on. And I think that I have just been drawn towards understanding more and more, the negative downsides and the impact that the modern American lifestyle and, food system and toxin exposure and all these things like have on an individual's life. And so I have just been very, very driven and personally just interested in trying a bunch of things like interventions that I think are useful and that lead to a better quality of life. Like when I went paleo in 2015, I went from eating, like I was in college and I went from drinking beer, eating pizza, like making pasta almost every night for dinner to a very different way of eating. And I like had better energy. My skin cleared up. I felt better. Like almost every aspect of my life changed for the better in a very brief period of time. And that experience, I think for me, has really rooted and like made me feel very strongly that making changes and improvements to your health are some of the highest leverage and most important changes that an individual can make in their lives. And so I'm just very interested generally in what are those changes that I can and should be making, what works for me, what works with, for others. And, so I try a lot of stuff myself.
Recognizing, and let's just say calling out right now that this is not professional health advice that somebody needs to consult with their physician, right? Like we're not absolve ourselves from any kind of disclaimers there. And recognizing that things are different for each individual person, that there are, genetic changes, epigenetics that we need to look at. That, all of that aside, what are a couple of the core tenets that you look at that you would say, if somebody's listening and they want to take their health a little bit more seriously, they're a founder, they're busy, they're working a ton, they have gotten out of the way, they're sitting down all the time. What are the 4 or 5 things that you would say, hey, I would recommend starting here at least? Because it's overwhelming. We can't all do everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like maybe the 3 things I would say. I would also, by the way, I would push back on the like consult your physician. I think physicians have overseen the worst collapse in American health ever.
This is just a disclaimer. This is so that way I don't get sued for bad
I don't think
medical
anyone will
advice.
sue you for this. It's not medical advice, but
Okay.
I think that the 3 lifestyle things that I would do is I would strongly recommend just trying to get like 10,000 steps a day. I think is a very, very simple thing, like move regularly. I think, and if you can get 2 to 3 strength training sessions in a week, I think everyone should be strength training, especially women. I think it's insane that people are like, women shouldn't strength train because they'll get bulky and it'll make them look gross. It's like, that never happens, literally almost never. And so I think basically everyone should be strength training. Everyone should be trying to get at least 10,000 steps a day and just moving their bodies. A second thing is I think avoiding ultra processed foods, especially the big 3, what I call the big 3, like corn, soy, and wheat. Corn, soy, wheat are ultra processed. As they're ultra subsidized, and as a result, they're like in all of our foods. They're in their most processed form. Like soybean oil, soybeans become subsidized to the tune of around $4 billion a year. And because of that, they go from almost no one eats soybean oil. No one enjoys it for the taste. No one's like, drizzle soybean oil on salad because it tastes amazing. But it becomes like almost 20% of the average American's daily caloric intake is in the form of soybean or other seed oils, not because they taste good, but because they're cheap. This is why high fructose corn syrup is used instead of sugar, is because it's cheap. And so I would just avoid, if you can, corn, soy, wheat. It will do wonders for your health, just like cutting these 3 things out. And then the last thing I think is becoming increasingly important and is like going to be the trans fats issue of our time is avoiding toxins. And if you've read about like forever chemicals, things like PFAS, things like phthalates and the like, mitigating or removing your regular repeated exposure to this class of chemicals is just a hugely important thing. And the things that I would do, the ways that I would address that are get a good water filter, generally reverse osmosis, or buy from something like Alive Waters or like a very clean spring water. The second thing I would do is like stop, cooking stuff in plastic, like use stainless steel pans, like swap out a bunch of your plastic Tupperware and things like this. And unfortunately, I think that eating out is like ordering in is a very big deal too. Like almost everything that you order in comes in some sort of Tupperware or cardboard or plastic thing that sheds a bunch of particles and other chemicals, leaches into the food. And I think that is like an underrated source of toxin exposure for a lot of people. And so if you can cut out your exposure to these sorts of like class of pesticides, chemicals, plastics, phthalates, things like that, it's going to make a substantial difference to your health.
These are incredible recommendations. I try to adhere to every single one of the things that you actually just mentioned. I like tracking this very, very well myself. I write down my own protocols, right? If you would, even down to what I'm eating, when I'm eating, how I'm eating it, and trying to track that for partly so I could know, a month into a protocol, how how well is it impacting me? Am I noticing any changes? So that way I can say, basically like almost like an A/B test, not truly A/B test, but just to understand if it's making a difference or not.
Yep.
What outside of what the advice that you just gave, if there were people that wanted to go further, dig deeper, are there a couple of influencers outside of Gary Brecka that you would say, I recommend listening to this podcast or reading this book or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, like, I have a monthly newsletter that I write that I think is a good resource in terms of like pointing, pointing
What is
people.
it? I didn't know that you had a monthly newsletter. What is it called?
It's called The Next. It's just
Okay.
Justin Mayers on Substack, and that's kind of it.
Perfect. I
Yeah.
will check it out.
Yeah,
That sounds good.
yeah. So I think that's where I like share most of my best stuff.
Okay. Speaking of which, then, it's been really great having you here. If people wanted to follow you, work with you, what is the best way for them to get in touch, stay in touch?
Yeah, I honestly think the Substack, like
Okay.
I think is the best place to just kind of follow along with what I'm doing and, keep appraised of the things that I'm working on, thinking, all of that. I would say is the best.
Well, I love it. You are thinking about a lot of things systematically and putting them to the test. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. I've learned a lot from you. This has been really fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And everybody else, thank you for tuning in. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to the Up Arrow podcast with William Harris. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.